Uh, Today we have Professor Ong with us. He is a professor in Institute of Environment and Sustainability in UCLA. His focus is on urban planning, social welfare, and Asian American studies. I will let you talk more if you want about yourself, and then we can start the presentation.
Just hi, and thank you for the invitation. It's too bad I don't have the chance to go down there in person, but hopefully sometime in the future, I'm going to make a visit down to Irvine because I have wonderful colleagues and friends down there.
We would love that. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
You're welcome. So should we get started? Great. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is essentially what I see as a dilemma or a contradiction in our effort to promote sustainable transportation and also just affordable housing. Next slide, please. So this work is done as part of a larger project. In the first slide, I list some of the collaborators for this current project, but the larger project really is to try to understand the causes, patterns, and consequences of racial and class inequality as they're embedded in what we call the urban spatial structure. You know, how do we make cities? How do we make regions in a way that is structured around racial and class disparities? Unfortunate reality of our society, and I think one for me personally that we need to understand, but more than just understand, we need to figure ways of moving beyond this unequal urban spatial structure. The project, this particular part of the project examines the geographic location of affordable housing. And we're talking about Section 8 vouchers. And this is in respect to two major public policies. And the central question is whether changes in the geographic patterns are moving us as a society in terms of affordable housing to meet both sustainability and social justice. Next slide, please. So we use an underlying theoretical foundation that comes out of urban economics, which is really trying to understand how land values, residential, commercial spaces, and so forth, in terms of the location, interacts with transportation costs. And out of that sort of modeling, we begin understanding, why do we have more dense neighborhoods? Why do we have dense and concentrated commercial activities? These powerful market forces in terms of land and in transportation interact to structure the way we live. But the reality is that it's just not economics. There's also social political dynamics at work that structures our urban space. And one of the ways it's structured is to stratify and segregate places. And it creates this sort of spatial geographic hierarchy along racial and class lines. And this happens beyond just what the market outcomes are. We live every day, and I think we're very familiar at an intuitive sense about this spatial hierarchy. We understand that, for example, neighborhoods in Irvine is very different than neighborhoods in parts of Anaheim. And so this is a reality that we're trying to understand through our research. Much of our understanding in terms of the consequences of this structure comes from Professor John Kane's work on spatial mismatch, where he looks at, in particular, in Detroit with suburbanization, the movement of jobs and whites into the suburbs, the consequences of those left behind, in particular, African Americans. Particularly African Americans, as jobs disperse, but they're trapped in the inner city. And so his work talks about the consequences of that urban restructuring in terms of higher unemployment for African Americans who are trapped in the inner city. we have gone beyond that, and there is a second iteration of this, which talks about spatial transportation mismatch. And the reality behind the spatial transportation mismatch is it's not just distance in terms of accessing opportunities. It is your ability or lack of ability to overcome those distances. And therefore, transportation becomes a key element in trying to understand, what are the consequences of our urban structure. So it's a combination of the geography as well as our ability or lack of ability to travel within the region. And this geographic inequality is also has a very environmental consequences. And so I've been very fortunate to have worked with Professor Halston, Professor Wu, and Professor Weiner for a couple of decades now, looking at the environmental consequences of the urban spatial structure, particularly the inequality in terms of exposure to localized pollutants from mobile sources. Next slide, please. So, like I mentioned, this research looks at sort of two, I consider, very noble policies and goals for our society. The first is to modify our affordable housing programs in a way that we break the cycle of racial class segregation and the intergenerational reproduction of poverty. And so there's a huge literature that shows us that where you grow up essentially sets the trajectory of where you end up as an adult. If you grow up in poor neighborhoods, poverty neighborhoods, a combination of different things, the lack of good education, poor health conditions, risk, and so forth, that shapes what's going to happen when you become an adult. And so part of this idea of breaking the cycle of poverty is very much embedded within the urban spatial structure and how we ought to change it. A stream of research that's particularly useful is the moving to opportunity research. And that was a social experiment to see what happens if we do offer the opportunity for poor families to move out of poverty neighborhoods and into better neighborhoods in terms of opportunities. And the results have been mixed. There have certainly been gains, but there's also once the gains that they were looking for didn't materialize. But for me, one of the most profound long-term change is the gain made by young children in terms of the education. What the research shows us is we move people out early enough, we move children out early enough, that they benefit from being in better neighborhoods in terms of education and employment in the future. And so this idea of decentralizing the poverty has an empirical evidence that sort of guides us in terms of how we think about our policies. And we could see that, for example, in a shift away from project-based housing, that is, for example, the massive housing projects that we have had in the past, to tenant-based housing. That is, we give people who have housing subsidy a choice in terms of where to live, so long as the landlord is willing to accept those payments. And we also have a commitment to fair housing. That is to address racial segregation that has plagued our society for centuries. Next slide, please. So the second major societal goal that's part of this project is addressing climate change. And there's no question in my mind that California has been on the forefront in terms of pushing initiatives to minimize the impact on our environment. And one of the strategies is reducing VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And that in turn, lowers the production of greenhouse gases that, if not controlled, contributes to an acceleration in global warming. One of the key mechanisms in terms of climate change is promoting what people talk about as sustainable development that reduces the need for vehicle travel. That is, let's think about how we promote neighborhoods that are walkable, that have access to public transit, that have other sort of characteristics that, in a sense, enable people to rely less on their cars. And California, within this sort of larger climate change initiative, has also been committed to environmental justice within the climate change effort. And that is embedded both in legislation and policy. So those are the two major policy goals that I want to look at in terms of what's happening with affordable housing. Next slide, please. So the research question really is, the way we operationalize it, is to look at the location of Section 8 voucher housing. This is a program that essentially gives subsidies to individual households, families, and they can pick from what's available in the market so long as the landlord is willing to participate in the program. And the question is that what are the locations of these housing units, particularly in respect to transportation sustainability and fair and just housing. The approach that we're taking is first to develop a baseline in terms of where Section 8 housing is located, and then also look at the changes between 2012, the base year, and 2019 using tract level data. And we're doing this for all California. We rely on a number of different data sources, and I list some of those there. We draw heavily from work we have done previously with CARB, California Air Resource Board, as well as Caltrans. And so for this study, we're looking at a number of neighborhood indicators, many of it around transportation, but also around other quality of life indicators and opportunity indicators. And you see before you a list of those variables. I'm not going to go through them individually, but we're trying to use a mix of indicators to cover a broad spectrum of the impact on renters. Next slide, please. So this diagram is a simple diagram of net changes at the tract level of Section 8 housing. So the orange and light blue is essentially the number of Section 8 housing unit in 2012. And the blue and light blue is the number of Section 8 housing in 2019. So the good story is that we are expanding the coverage of Section 8 housing. So we're providing more affordable units. But there's been real changes in the location. So in just the orange area, that represents tracts that have lost units. That is, in 2012, they had more units than they had in 2019. The blue area on the right represent the gains. These are tracts where in 2019, there's more units than in 2012. We're not talking about changes within tracts. There's certainly changes also occurring within tracts. These represent the shift in location of Section 8 housing at the tract level. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual representation of the concentration, relative concentration of the 2012 Section 8 housing, and that's on the left. The darker the color, the higher the concentration. Concentration is just the percentage of all housing units that are Section 8. Again, in going back to one of the major goals is to try to decentralize the location of poor people away from poverty areas. And on the right is a map of the poverty areas in terms of poverty rates, percentage of families and individuals below the federal poverty line. And much of this pattern you should be familiar with, particularly if you look down at Orange County and parts of Orange County that around Anaheim and areas such as that. So one of the things you notice is that Section 8 housing in 2012, despite the goal of promoting greater mobility, we see that it's overly concentrated in poor areas. Next slide, please. This slide shows on the left changes between 2012 and 2019. The green, so it ranges from essentially no changes, that's in the yellow, to a decline in the number of units, and that's orange. But where the gains are occurring is represented by the green and the blue. And again, on the right is our map of poverty levels. And visually, the first thing you just notice and interpret visually is that I'm not sure from this that we're really making much improvement in offering opportunities for Section 8 residents to move away from high poverty areas. Next slide. So let's look at the indicators in terms of where Section 8 housing is located. So in both of these graphs, the blue bars are the distribution of the baseline Section 8 housing, those that existed in 2012. The orange represents the change in units between 2012 and 2019. And what we've done is, for example, rank every tract in California by household VMT, average house VMT, as well as rank every tract by average job commute VMT. On the left of each graph, the bars are in the neighborhoods with the lowest VMT. And on the right, on both graphs, are the tracts with the highest average VMT. And what you see is that in the baseline, by both measures, Section 8 housings are more likely to be in low VMT neighborhoods. It doesn't mean that each individual have low VMT, but it does represent that within that neighborhood, that's the average sort of behavior in terms of travel. So we see that in the baseline that there is a higher representation in low VMT. What's remarkable is looking at the orange bars. And there you see that there's been a very significant shift in the units that changed between 2012 and 2019 towards neighborhoods with the lowest VMTs. Matter of fact, if you look on the graph on the left, for the highest, there's been actually a loss in terms of Section 8 housing in the neighborhoods with highest VMT. Next graph, please. Next slide, please. And so another measure that we quite often use in the field of transportation sustainability is the walkability of the neighborhood. And that is a combination of different things, such as the density, the network, the types of mixed uses that's available. So we usually define walkability, or desirable walkability, as dense neighborhoods with networks that are there, and a mix of commercial activities so people can shop and do other activities within their neighborhoods. And on the right is another standard measure that we look at in sustainable transportation, is access to high quality transit. And so this is a measure essentially of what proportion of each tract in terms of the population that can be within walking distance to a high frequency transit stop. Again, so what you see is in the blue is that Section 8 tends to be overrepresented in more walkable neighborhoods as defined by standard indicators. And they tend to be slightly more represented in high quality transit locations. That overrepresentation becomes even more dramatic and enhanced in terms of looking at where the changes in Section 8 housing units are located. So these are standard measures of transportation sustainability, VMT, walkability, access to the public transit. it would appear that by these simple metrics, we are moving in terms of affordable housing, Section 8 housing, to more transportation sustainable neighborhoods. Next slide, please. However, those movements come with a very heavy cost. And one of the ways of thinking about costs is the externalities that are imposed on individuals. That is, certainly our health is defined by many personal things. It's defined by our access to good food. It's defined by our access to health insurance. But what we want to look at are some of the environmental, that is the context within which one lives in terms of health costs, or those things associated with high health burdens. On the left is looking at vehicle accident rates. And this is normalized by the number of mile lanes in a neighborhood. And on the right is exposure to pollution. And so both of these is, there's no question they're associated with negative health outcomes and therefore negative higher health costs. What we see is that Section 8 housing is overly represented in risky areas, and it has become more so over time. Next slide, please. There's also the question about what's been happening with Section 8 housing in terms of class and racial segregation. And one of the things we want to do in fair housing is to desegregate. That is, people should not be forced to have to live only in certain neighborhoods because of the color of their skin, or because they have low income and are dependent on certain types of public assistance. What we see is a dramatic increase in terms of class segregation in Section 8 housing when we look at the orange bars. Then all the changes are concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods. In terms of racial segregation, and you can see down on the right, we started off being segregated in terms of Section 8 housing, and we haven't made much improvement. So that's more of a persistence of a pattern that we saw before. Next slide, please. The other one is in terms of employment opportunities. And so we use two measures to think about, on the average, what are the employment opportunities. One is in terms of the neighborhood unemployment rate. That gives us a sense of how well overall, on the average, workers are performing in the labor market. And on the right is what we call the jobs housing fit. Essentially, this is a much better measure than some of our traditional gravity model job access indicators, because this takes into account particularly low income workers, which is the main focus of this talk and our study, those who are eligible for Section 8 housing. So what you see on the left is that Section 8 users in 2012 were disproportionately concentrated in neighborhoods with high unemployment, and that situation overall got worse in terms of changes between 2012 and 2019. You see the same problem on the right. That is, we see that Section 8 residents live in areas that have very few lower wage jobs that they are likely to hold if they're working, that their neighborhoods have lots of natural affordable units, that is, these are units with low rent, but no jobs in those neighborhoods. And they are not living in areas where there's lots of jobs. You can think about them as like retailing jobs, some of the service sector jobs. So in the neighborhoods where there's lots of jobs, unfortunately, there are very few affordable housing units. So the consequences when we have a job housing misfit is it forces the workers in this population to commute a lot longer in terms of getting to work. Next slide, please. So part of what's, I think, driving this is that this whole Section 8 is embedded in the rental market. And what's been happening during this time period is that the rental rents in California have grown much faster than the rate of inflation. And this is particularly true for units that just came on the market. And on the left, you could see what that is. So the bar farthest on the left graph is the average rent that's paid by all renters in terms of increase between 2012 and 2019. But the units that changed hand more recently, we're talking about a increase in current dollars about 30%. Now, one of the problems is that what we call fair market rates, this is the amount that is allowed under Section 8 to pay for in terms of rent. And so the graph on the right is maybe a little bit complicated, but essentially the vertical line represents the changes in the fair market rate. That is what the program is willing to pay. On the horizontal axis is the changes in the average rent. So we didn't have data necessarily on the more recent units. But essentially, you could think about the solid line dividing counties that where the real rents increase faster than the fair market rate. And if you just for the fact that you don't just use the average, you use the newer units, that's the dashed line. What we're seeing is that in the operation of Section 8, it's not keeping up with the rapid increases in rents that we've been experiencing in California. And I think that partly explains, or maybe greatly explains, why we have this reconfiguration, the geographic spatial reconfiguration of location Section 8. So next slide, please. So essentially what we're seeing is that the shift in housing certainly could be considered by standard measure as moving towards more transportation sustainable neighborhoods. But at the same time, it's imposing huge health, social, and employment costs. And I think this is creating a real challenge for state and local governments in terms of how we can simultaneously address climate change, at the same time promote racial and economic equity, particularly around affordable housing. There are some short-term processes and practices that we could do to mediate this unfortunate trade-off. That includes more active recruitments of landlords and better neighborhoods. It also includes intervention in terms of providing services to potential Section 8 renters to educate them and so forth. Those things could make a difference, but it doesn't tackle a longer term problem, which is really structural. It's embedded in the way our society operates and how it has created urban space. And that's a longer term and more greater challenge that we have to address in terms of how do we solve this problem of trying to meet both the transportation sustainability goals as well as our affordable housing goals. And urban and transportation planners, I think, should be involved very much in rethinking about how we do this. And it requires a transformation of how we practice as an institution. It requires us to use new information so we can understand what's happening and identifying what is apparently a contradiction or dilemma within the housing transportation intersection. So clearly, there's a huge challenge for us in the field of planning and transportation in terms of what are the next steps. And I think part of that is for us through events such as this to better understand the nature of the problem. So next slide, which is Chi. Thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat. Sylvie, do you want to open your mic and read it, or should I?
Can you read it to me?
Sure. Appreciate it, Maggie. Thank you, Professor Ong, for your amazing presentation. I have a quick question regarding to your point of shifting the affordable housing to the more transportation sustainable area. I'm wondering, maybe downtown or near downtown, are those transportation sustainable areas? But is there enough lands, enough empty lands for the affordable housing? Or do we need to redevelopment or infill or something?
You're absolutely right. Many of the areas that we define by traditional metrics, and maybe we need to rethink those metrics, but by traditional metrics, those are highly located in the core urban areas around the downtown areas. And so walkability, access to public transit, low VMT, those are all concentrated in the downtown areas. And so there are two issues in terms of that concentration. Many of those neighborhoods are disadvantaged neighborhoods. Yeah, but not all of them are. There are, like, if here in Los Angeles, if we look around the downtown area, for example, there are neighborhoods that meet these qualifications, but are not poor neighborhoods. There, for example, for those who know Los Angeles, the Art District. There are the areas now being developed around the Staple Center. And so what we have is a very mixed picture of sustainable neighborhoods. There's also other types of sustainable neighborhoods, the more urban village outside downtown and so forth, but they tend to be much more the affluent areas in terms of that. If you think, for example, many of the here in Los Angeles, but also extending down to Orange County, the coastal cities. Many of the coastal cities, such as Manhattan Beach, Redondo, and so forth, they have a nice mix of commercial activities that you could walk to, right? And they don't necessarily have great public transit, but they also are in the coastal area here have their own transit system. But many people don't need the transit. So the real issue is that can we have affordable housing in areas that are both transportation sustainable, but also offers a better quality of life in terms of job access, in terms of education, in terms of safety? The answer is that the market is not allowing us to do that, and the reliance on the market makes it very difficult. So there's that trade-off in how we do it. For Los Angeles, and I'm not sure about Orange County, there's actually a much larger one. We are going to be facing a rental crisis in terms of rent, so long as we don't solve our overall housing supply problem. I'm an economist by training, so I have a knee-jerk reaction that if you increase the supply, you lower the cost, the price, the market prices. And so here in Los Angeles, because of NIMBYism, zoning, and other things, that we are making it very difficult for us to offer affordable housing, either through subsidies or through the market, so long as we constrain the supply. So there's some longer term things that we need to think about. We need to think about short-term solutions as well as long-term solutions. Long-term solution really is about how do we address the structural problems, the larger structural problems embedded in how we as a society build and operate our cities.
Thank you, Professor Ong.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Isn't it a better idea to, instead of thinking about making affordable housing, thinking about distributing jobs or like the supply system? Because even though if we like generate affordable housing, there will be a competition for them, and it will attract more people to those areas, and it would be more demand, and then the prices might go up again. So how about like distributing the population based on the jobs that we put other places in like less crowded areas in or in poor neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think we could think about this and decompose this in several ways. One is the location of jobs, right? So one strategy people talk about is there a way we could restructure the distribution of jobs in a way that lowers the demand for travel? And the answer is that there's probably marginal ways you could do that. But the reality is that we have job clustering. We have industrial clusters because essentially the agglomeration effects. And agglomeration effects are those where proximity of employers and firms produce positive outcomes in terms of their interactions, in terms of knowledge and so forth. And so we don't necessarily want to disrupt, the positive aspects of agglomeration that operates through the market. But there's also a reality that part of the distribution of jobs is driven by policies and political decisions, primarily through zoning and the way we grant building construction and so forth. And so there's a part of it that is somewhat artificially produced, not by the market in terms of agglomeration effect, but produced by policy. Now, how much that, we don't know. So if the classical, counter argument is looking at Houston to not the professor, but the city, because they don't have real zoning in the sense that we think about zoning. And what you see there is still, massive agglomeration effects. So it's very hard to reconfigure on the job side. We could do it on the margin. Can we reconfigure it on the residential side and make places more open and create units that are more affordable? So there's several. You can't get away from land value problems. Certain areas have, because of the amenities and proximity, have high value. Or potentially high values. Around public transit areas that are outside of certain real disadvantaged neighborhoods, land values around those areas are very high. So, and it's understandable. They're desirable because, for many people, being able to walk to mass transit, take mass transit. A good example in the Bay Area is around BART stations. Particularly on the suburban areas. And so that's led to the production of lots of housing. So, but the challenge is making sure those housing are produced in a way that it includes a fair segment of affordable housing. And the market won't do that by itself. The market has a tendency to go after the biggest paying renters. And so we now have, and we've been pushing for policies that say that the new development, you have to have a certain amount of affordable housing. And you can make it affordable in different ways, through cross subsidy, by creating smaller units and so forth. So there's room for improvement in terms of creating more access for lower income renters in these neighborhoods. So I would say we're making progress, but it's slow progress. And it's also one that meets with a great deal of political resistance. That's an unfortunate reality in terms of trying to push some of these social agendas, is that there's a huge amount of pushback in terms of, so for example, neighborhoods are fighting the ability of cities to come into agreement with higher density development in exchange for more affordable units. So we can have these policies, but implementing them are very difficult. So good ideas and a huge challenge for those in housing and transportation. in terms of how we implement these things.
Thank you. We have another question from Montana. Do you want to tell it?
Yes, hello. I have a question. This kind of goes with what we were just discussing. Has any thought been given towards maybe having a program where you would have investors invest in making low-income housing in exchange for visas, similar to like an EB-5 program for industry?
Yes, there's certainly, there's a number of sort of programs to provide incentives for investments in these neighborhoods or in jobs that create jobs. So we've done some research on immigrant investors. And other people have done much more research on that. The idea sounds good. The implementation's been very bad. The investors overestimate the number of jobs, and the jobs are not, in terms of giving access and the quality of jobs are not necessarily are that great. So immigrant investors mixed results, but it tends, lots of money tends not to sort of trickle down. Canada has even a much more extensive immigrant investor program than the US, and they've had it for a much longer time. And has it improved things? It's questionable. For those who have gone up to Vancouver, that's been one of the hotbeds of immigrant investors. Has it made it more equitable, and has it given more residential opportunities to particularly the disadvantaged population? As far as I could tell, no. So these investment programs are mixed. We also have had a long history of investment or giving incentives to invest in disadvantaged neighborhoods to hopefully make them better in terms of jobs and so forth. One of my colleagues, Jim Spencer, has done, and I've done a little bit of work with him on those type of investment strategies. And again, we find extremely mixed results and actually sort of not great results. Those incentives don't really trickle down and help the most disadvantaged. And then finally, we have a new version of this investment where we allow investors in certain neighborhoods with the hope that it will stimulate the neighborhoods. The Los Angeles Times just a week or two ago had an article on that program. And essentially what they found is all the money is going to luxury units and so forth. So we've had a very mixed history of these sort of investor-driven efforts to solve these problems. Conceptually, not a bad idea. In practice, very poorly done.
I completely understand what you mean by the in practice. I was reading about some of the same problems you were just talking about. I feel like maybe one way would be if you had a program, you would have to mandate the percent affordable units, but I don't know how that would be done.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is that it's in some ways easy to come up with simplistic policies. It's much harder to implement, and it's even harder to monitor whether the implementation is effective. That takes a lot of effort and research to be done to do that. And some of it's very hard. So for example, if you look at many of these agreements, development agreements that we've been using to address some of the housing problems, affordable housing problems, there actually is no central database to assess whether or not those affordable housing really are going to the most needy and whether over time they stay with the most needy. We assume it does because our policy says that the developer should do that. Do we empirically know that's true or not? So far as I know, we don't have strong empirical evidence that's been true. So it's been challenging in terms of implementing policies. It's been challenging in terms of monitoring whether on the long term those policies are effective or not. And it is actually up to researchers like you new researchers coming through the pipeline to sort of do that type of work so we can understand what really works and what does not work and what needs to be improved. I think that's one of the huge challenges in terms of how we practice as planners.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from audience? Okay. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Professor Ong, for accepting our invitation and giving us this talk. It was really good and we enjoyed it.
Okay. Have a good day. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much and have a great weekend, Professor Ong.
Thank you. I will go out for a long cycling ride.